So welcome everyone. My name is Daniel Weinstock. I'm a professor at McGill in the Faculty of Law and the Department of Philosophy, but more relevantly to our meeting today, I'm the holder of the Katharine A. Pearson Chair in Civil Society and Public Policy. And it's a great pleasure to welcome all of you to this webinar on the arts, the public-facing arts and the pandemic. So let me tell you a little bit about the webinar series which this is a part of. The chair that I was awarded about a year and a half ago now has as its mandate to study the relationship between civil society organizations, artistic, religious, community-based, and the state. When the pandemic hit, I thought that it would be interesting and important to start looking into ways in which the pandemic had affected all of these different kinds of organizations that make up the rich tapestry of the civil society of Montreal, of Quebec, of Canada, and to see how they had all adapted to these radically different circumstances, especially civil society organizations whose activities have an important public dimension, whose either rituals or meetings or events are in an important sense ones that bring people together in ways which the pandemic made either difficult or impossible. So this is the third of our series. We've held one on religious organizations. We had one on the visual arts. And today we're going to be talking with four people whose job it is in very different ways and with respect to very different art forms to bring the arts into a public setting and to look into the challenges that they faced during the last 14 months and indeed the challenges that they see themselves facing in the months and perhaps even years to come. So I should say that, well, welcome to everybody who's in attendance. We're going to have a chat with our four guests who I'll be introducing in a moment. And then hopefully in the last 10 or 15 minutes have time for a Q&A. There's a Q&A function, which you're all probably all familiar with 14 months into this Zoom existence. And I invite you to type questions into the Q&A. Le séminaire se déroulera en bilingue passif, c'est-à-dire que tout le monde parle la langue de son choix en prenant pour acquis que tout le monde peut comprendre la langue de l'autre. Donc, je poserai des questions à la fois en anglais et en français et mes panélistes décideront de la langue dans laquelle ils s'adresseront à vous. Et les questions peuvent donc être posées en anglais ou en français. I should say that that today's webinar is being recorded and it'll be made available for viewing on the YouTube platform on the Pearson Chair's YouTube channel. And we'll send you a link in the days to follow and feel free to disseminate it as widely as you please. So let me introduce our four guests today. I'll just introduce them and then get started with the discussion. Our first guest is Mary-Dailey Desmarais, who is the Chief Curator of the Montreal Museum of Fine Arts. Mary-Dailey oversees a multidisciplinary team dedicated to enriching, promulgating, and preserving a collection of over 45,000 artworks and objects dating from antiquity to the present. She's also responsible for devising and developing the MMFA's exhibition and publication projects. She's a specialist in modern and contemporary art. In addition to the exhibits she's curated, she's edited several books and contributed to numerous anthologies, exhibition catalogs, journals on art theory and criticism. A frequently invited guest speaker at public institutions across North America. She also served on the jury of the Sobey Art Award and the Giverny Capital Prize. Philippe Lambert, finissant de l'École nationale de théâtre en 1996, il a œuvré principalement dans le domaine théâtral. Sa connaissance et surtout sa curiosité pour les nouvelles dramaturgies l'ont amené naturellement vers l'enseignement à l'École nationale de théâtre du Canada, à l'École supérieure de théâtre de l'UQAM et à la mise en scène. Adjoint à la direction artistique de la Licorne de 2008 à 2019, il prend ensuite les rênes du théâtre de la rue Papineau et devient directeur artistique et général. Pour la Manufacture et la Licorne, il a également signé plusieurs spectacles dont Midsummer, Pervers, Babysitter, Psychédélique Marie-Lou, La Maison aux 67 langues. Il est aussi président du comité d'évaluation théâtre du Conseil des arts de Montréal et il siège au conseil d'administration de l'organisme. Kathy Levy. Kathy has led the National Arts Centre's dance department for 2 decades and has earned an enviable reputation throughout the Canadian and international dance communities. She presents a full season of national and international dance companies and artists and has co-produced over 100 new works. She's developed an array of outreach and enhancement activities to support artists, students, and audiences, such as the NAC CGI Youth Commission for Dance, the Associate Dance Artist Program, launched in 2007, and the Visiting Dance Artist Program, launched in 2018. Project supported through partnership with the Canada Council for the Arts. She serves on several committees, boards, and panels, and in 2019, she received the Order of Canada in recognition of her dedication to the field. Dan Seligman has been active in the Montreal music scene since 2000. He's managed the band Stars, the Unicorns, So-Called, and Eve Jarvis through the company that he co-owns called Danagement. In 2002, he co-founded the multidisciplinary festival Pop Montreal, and he remains the festival's creative director. In 20 years, Pop Montreal has produced thousands of shows and events throughout Montreal and around the world. Its festival has worked with such artists as Yellowman, Patti Smith, Alanis Obomsawin, Arcade Fire, and Grimes. Bienvenue à tous. Thank you so much to all of you for having agreed to take part in this conversation. So to get us started, I'd like to ask you to project yourselves all back about 14 months now to March of 2020. I don't know whether it feels to you like 14 months or 14 years or 14 centuries. I can tell you where I was when I first realized that the world was going to undergo perhaps more of a change than we had thought it would when we first heard of the COVID virus. I actually had tickets for the Netherlands Dance Theater at Place des Arts on Wednesday, which I guess was the 11th to the 12th of March. And that day I had actually got to McGill, got to my office, had a normal slate of activities, but it started sounding, as we were listening to one another talk on the bus going back home, that the government might be doing something. I think that schools had been canceled for that Friday so that the government could sort of take a step back and decide what to do. And I think we all had a kind of an uh-oh moment around the same time, perhaps on that Wednesday. And tickets in hand, my wife and I decided, deliberated about what we do, and we actually decided not to go because we were just too worried about the uncertainty of this virus. That was the last performance that was held at Place des Arts before Quebec society and societies around the world basically were put on pause, a pause that we have now been going through with different levels of confinement, reconfinement, deconfinement for the last 14 months with no immediate end in sight, though as we speak, perhaps a little bit more light at the end of the tunnel than has been the case until now. So I'd like to get a sense of what your first thoughts were when on that Wednesday or sometime in that week, you realized that the world was going to change, that your world was going to change. And as you started thinking about what it meant for your professional and artistic endeavors, and also perhaps to reflect 14 months later on whether you feel that you're about at the place that you expected that you would be. So I'm going to just go around the table to let all of you chime in on this, perhaps in alphabetical order. So Mary-Dailey, perhaps if you could start us off.
Sure. Alors, bonjour. D'abord et avant tout, j'aimerais dire un grand merci à Professeur Weinstock et l'Université de McGill pour l'invitation à participer à ce webinaire aujourd'hui. C'est un grand plaisir d'être avec vous. Alors, il y a 14 mois, c'est drôle que ce que vous avez dit, does it feel like 14 months or 14 years? I think that for all of us, time has sort of become a blur. Cela dit, je me souviens très bien du moment où le musée a fermé ses portes. En fait, on était au plein milieu de l'installation de l'exposition Signac et les Indépendants. It was, as you said, this kind of uh-oh moment. What does this mean for the future? How long will we be closed? I will say that at the museum, with that particular exhibition, we were rather lucky because it was an exhibition around a private collection that we knew would only be presented in Montreal, which meant that prolonging the dates was actually relatively easy. But of course, the immediate thought was also comment est-ce qu'on garde le contact avec nos publics. On voulait vraiment être là pour les personnes qui soutiennent le musée. Vous savez qu'on a un grand programme en art-thérapie. On voyait l'impact psychologique que la pandémie allait avoir et toutes les équipes se sont mobilisées très, très vite pour pivoter vers le virtuel. It was really kind of incredible and very moving to be a part of that. I would say, in hindsight, I don't think anybody the world over anticipated how long the pandemic would last. When the museum first closed its doors, we thought we were looking at 2 weeks, really, and then the months prolonged, and then you had to go through kind of all of the attendant programming changes, staffing changes, etc. Certainly, the impact, the psychological impact on employees and on working mothers, parents, working mothers and fathers, en fait, parce que les écoles étaient fermées pendant une longue période à Montréal et c'était très, très difficile pour les parents de travailler en même temps de s'occuper de leurs enfants, the fatigue, the Zoom fatigue, all of these were things that were very difficult and very hard to anticipate at the onset of the pandemic. That said, there is this expression in English, there's a silver lining to every cloud. I will say that the pandemic allowed us the opportunity with our doors closed to really think about what is important to us as an institution, what are the kinds of programs that we want to develop, how can we stay connected when the museum doors are closed, what are the kinds of virtual programs that we want to develop, and how will, for the long term, cet engagement virtuel, cet engagement numérique, comment est-ce que ça va changer notre façon d'interagir avec nos publics. Donc, I think that in some ways, while I would be absolutely loath to call the pandemic a blessing, it did afford us an opportunity for reflection that we wouldn't have otherwise, parce qu'on roule à une telle vitesse que c'est difficile à prendre le temps autrement. Alors, je passe la parole à mes collègues. Je suis curieuse de les entendre. Merci.
Philippe, du côté du théâtre, à quoi ça ressemblait? Oh.
Oui, ça va. Alors, j'étais, moi, en salle de répétition et on accrochait les lampes et on faisait du focus et des intensités. Et puis, on faisait des blagues en disant « on est en train de faire ça pour rien ». Et comme de fait, le soir même, il annonçait que tous les théâtres fermaient. Nous, il y a eu un moment où il laissait les salles ouvertes en bas de 250 places. Donc, nous, on a une salle de 200 et une salle de 100. Donc, on était un petit peu dans un entre-deux. On se disait, OK, mais là, si les deux salles jouent en même temps, on est considéré comme au-dessus de 250. Donc, on a donc pris rapidement la décision de fermer. Donc, le spectacle qui jouait dans la petite salle au moment était très triste. Eux, ils espéraient qu'on puisse continuer une journée ou deux encore, on ne savait pas. Mais finalement, pour la santé de tout le monde, ça a été comme une décision, c'est difficile hein, parce qu'il faut la prendre rapidement, mais c'est ce qu'on a fait. Puis, nous, en théâtre, on termine en juin. Donc, pendant tout l'été, on a eu le temps de voir venir un petit peu, d'anticiper ce qui se passait. On a travaillé. Normalement, on est en vacances, donc il a fallu être au travail, dans notre tête, dans nos projections, prévoir. Il faut tout repenser nos façons de fonctionner. C'est ça qui a été très difficile. Et on a eu un peu d'espoir. En septembre, on a pu ouvrir. Donc, pour un mois, on a réussi à présenter un spectacle pendant 20 représentations. Et au moment où le deuxième spectacle commençait, début octobre, là, ils ont refermé. Et ça a été un coup dur parce qu'on ne le voyait pas venir du tout. On pensait que ça allait bien, qu'il allait laisser les théâtres ouverts avec les mesures très, très sécuritaires. On se sentait en confiance. On avait une jauge réduite de 50 personnes dans notre grande salle. Donc, on se disait, ça va bien aller. Et quand il a annoncé ça, je pense qu'on a tous été surpris, un peu en colère au début parce qu'on disait, mais voyons, et on comprenait en même temps que c'est un message politique aussi que le gouvernement voulait envoyer. Et après ça, ça a été la traversée du désert. Et rapidement, j'avais choisi de faire une captation, parce qu'on en a parlé beaucoup en théâtre, des captations web, en tout cas. Donc, j'avais prévu. Dans ma tête, je me disais, je veux l'essayer. Je ne suis pas un partisan de ça. Je ne crois pas que l'art vivant peut se transmettre pleinement de cette manière-là, mais je me disais, si je ne le fais pas, je ne le saurai jamais. Donc, en novembre, on avait déjà prévu de faire une captation d'une pièce qui devait être présentée. Mais moi, dans ma tête, cette captation-là se faisait devant public. Donc, c'était avant qu'il referme. Donc, dans ma tête, c'était ça finalement. Il n'y a pas eu de public. Et c'est là que je trouve que la transmission de l'art vivant sans public, ce n'est pas la même chose. Et finalement, ben, on a pu rouvrir depuis la fin mars. Et on est très heureux. On présente le spectacle avec Guylaine Tremblay, un solo. Et on espère que ça continue pour l'instant.
Kathy.
It's interesting that you mentioned Netherlands Dance Theatre. Also, thank you very much for this discussion, because these Zoom discussions where we get to be in touch with our colleagues and hear how everybody's doing have been part of the lifeline of how we have gotten through some of these 14 months. So I would say that right off the top. But, you know, I was at the Tuesday night performance of Netherlands Dance Theatre because we were meant to welcome Netherlands Dance Theatre to the dance season at the National Arts Centre immediately following Place des Arts. So on the Thursday, I was on a train coming back from Ottawa to Montreal when I heard Legault's answer. And I live in Montreal and work in Ottawa. So I've been straddling these two provincial realities for 14 months. And as many of you know, they couldn't be more different and more the same. And of course, in Ottawa, you're literally 2 minutes away from Quebec, so we have a lot of issues between Gatineau and Ottawa that we've been dealing with. But the immediate response was, oh my gosh, what are we going to do about the artists next week? How are we going to get Netherlands Dance Theatre back to Amsterdam? How are we going to deal with all the public that have performances, tickets to performances? So we were very much dealing with what was right in front of our nose, which was having to cancel things and at the same time trying to hold on to things, because like Mary-Dailey said, we thought maybe it was going to be a couple of weeks. So maybe we'll only cancel April and we'll hold on to what we have in May. Alongside that, my colleague in popular music, Heather Gibson, immediately created this partnership with Facebook. And one of the key messages from the National Arts Centre as a public-facing institution was we have to support artists right across the country. And together they created a program called Canada Performs that was designed to get some fast cash into the hands of artists, at first musicians, but dance artists and theater artists also became part of it. And what they did was they delivered 45-minute performances live on Facebook. And this became, the sense of like, well, we're going to help them pay their rent for the month of April. We're going to help them pay their rent for the month of May. But this program really took off. It attracted other sponsors, and people really liked, I think, the immediacy of this message that artists across the country, live in their living rooms or in their kitchens, were able to do performances. And it sort of laid the groundwork for how we were each in the disciplines. There are 6 different disciplines active at the National Arts Centre. We're going to start delivering live stream performances. I think the summer for us was really planning the unplannable. That phrase keeps going on in my head. Are we going to be able to do this? Well, we're going to try. Plan A, plan B, plan C. And one of the things that we pivoted to, and that also became one of the popular words in French and English, was to try and support live stream performances across the country. So all fall, we did a project called Dance Forth, Danse en Vol, where from literally the east to the west, we supported 8 different performances of artists, helping them get back in the studios, rehearse, perform, get those performances out to an audience on Thursday evenings throughout the country, free to the public, have an engagement with audiences across the country, but also, again, supporting artists to learn what it was like. I mean, most dance artists have not created for a digital world. We were creating a digital stage along with them. So who's their videographer? Who are their lighting people? All of these things were new concerns for artists at that time. I would say that, we then never expected that we would do another Dance en Vol in the spring of this year. We planned, because we knew we couldn't do performances, another 9 events. I was holding on for dear life to a Canadian spring season in May of 2021. So each time we've had to cancel something, we've had something there to come up in the digital world. We had 9 different events planned for Dance Forth. Alberta shut down. We had to cancel 3 of them. Ontario shut down, we had to cancel others. So again, the guiding light for us is support the artists, lift up the sector. The whole National Arts Centre strategic plan has shifted to be there for recovery. And also, I think 14 months later, we don't think we're going to be back to exactly where we were. Things have changed. The social discussion has changed. Issues of inclusion are much more in the forefront than they've ever been. And all of us, I think, are gearing towards, yes, getting artists back on the stage and getting audiences back on the hall, but with a different kind of conversation that goes on with our public and with artists. I'll just say one other thing about that, and that is, 14 months later, dance artists in some cities are able to rehearse, but in other cities, they're still not able to. You can imagine in the National Ballet of Canada, artists are doing bar work, if they're lucky, with a little piece of dance floor and a half a bar in their kitchens. They're not able to jump and run and lift. So, the recovery is going to be very much about getting people back into the studio and helping them get to the level that they were. Unlike what athletes have been able to do, unlike what the film industry has been able to do, this is going to be essential for dance artists, particularly as we go forward.
Dan?
Yeah, I mean, rewinding 14 months, I think I initially, I was actually returning from Jamaica, and I got a notification after I checked in at the airport that South by Southwest was canceled. This was I think March 6th, and I was scheduled to fly to Austin in a week. And so that was kind of the first inkling of okay, maybe this is a real thing. And then we had a show on the 11th. It was a Wet'suwet'en fundraiser with Alyssa P. Isaac. And it was, I think, one of the last shows in Montreal. It was at La Tulipe. There was 550 people, sold out show. And then I think the next day, Legault had announced that everything was closing down. I have 2 kids in school, so they were home by the Friday, and we were like, okay, we'll see what happens. And then it was all kind of just okay, that's pretty much it. We kind of just pivoted, I guess that's the key word for this. And I think we decided in a few days after to try to do something in the digital realm. So we organized, inspired by the Italian Singing on the Balcony series, we asked Martha Wainwright to do Chanter sur les balcons de Montréal. And so the first one we did was on March 22nd. And yeah, we invited her to sing a Leonard Cohen song, and it actually it went off really well. It got tons of attention, 100,000 views on Facebook. So yeah, we kind of just started doing stuff right away, just to kind of be active and be engaged and figure out how to actually exist within the realm of a pandemic reality and presenting arts. We had an event scheduled for June, and a big kind of mini festival that we were doing at the Rialto Theatre in Montreal. So it was a multidisciplinary event with artists, film, music, panels. So within a few weeks, we were okay, this isn't going to happen in real life. And we started working on a digital version of that. And we created we built a whole new website platform that would allow us to present digitally. And so that went really well. It was successful. We kind of figured out how to integrate live streaming. We did a bunch of research, etc. I think sometime in the spring, I attended one of you had presented a panel discussion on what some of the realities of the pandemic and social gathering. And I think I had asked a question, do you think it's possible to live music will happen, in the next few months. And you're like, no, it's impossible. It's not going to happen for a while. But I mean, our goal was like, we got lucky, like Philippe, our main festival event was scheduled for September. So it was like the 1 month, the limited window where the government allowed festivals to happen and live events to happen. So we produced the festival within like a pandemic reality. So socially distanced, everyone in mass, seated. We changed the format of the festival. It was also hybrid. So like 95% of it was also streamed. And we changed the format so there weren't multi-band performances. It was like you paid for your ticket, you went in, you sat down, the artist performed for 20-25 minutes and it was over. So everything was very limited. We really there was no bar, there was less socializing, obviously, but people loved it. I mean, I don't think I've experienced audiences as appreciative, because it was just like a taste of like, that connection that everyone has been missing for so long. And yet I mean, I applaud like the NAC and like all these institutions in Canada, like Patrimoine Canadien, Factor, SODEC, like all of these government institutions that are kind of keeping the arts afloat and allowing us to do these like virtual streams, which are, very difficult to actually monetize. And it's allowing institutions like Pop Montreal and independent artists to kind of exist. But I don't think it's a replacement for like live performance and like the connection that people feel from attending music or dance or theater.
So you've all anticipated questions that I was going to pose in different ways. So one of the questions you've all already touched on, and maybe I'll go back to Dan and ask him about this. So as someone who also kind of in some ways delivers content to publics, right? As a teacher, I'm used to being in a classroom and talking to students, and the idea that this could happen in a context other than a classroom with actual three-dimensional students in front of me, being able to pick up on their physical cues about whether they're catching on, whether they're bored, etc., seemed completely inconceivable to me. And for the first semester of the pandemic, I kind of went through Zoom teaching almost in protest. And then I thought, well, maybe there's something, if you can't beat it, join it, right? And see whether there aren't some things about the Zoom world that might actually be things that you can't achieve in the physical world. And one of the things that I realized was, as I was putting together the syllabus for one of my classes, I realized, hey, I know all of the people who I'm assigning to my students to read. I could just email them and tell them whether they are in Spain or in California or in British Columbia, hey, why don't you, join us for the discussion of your work? And they were all so thrilled to do it. Now, obviously, it had the strange format that we know now. We're all staring at a screen, looking at each other but there was something that I couldn't have achieved otherwise. So I'd like to ask all of you, as you have pivoted, to use Dan's word, towards, at least in large measure, virtual formats, des captations de spectacles, comme Philippe l'a mentionné, keeping the museum in contact with its public in different ways. Are there things that you see surviving beyond the pandemic, not out of grim necessity, but perhaps because, hey, this is actually, at the same time as we're bringing people back into museums and into rooms and into theater spaces, maybe this is something that we learned that we can actually keep in the post-pandemic world. So I'll ask Dan to start us off on this. And it could be that the answer is nothing.
Yeah, I mean, I think definitely, for us moving forward, we're actually redeveloping our website now to integrate more, like, amongst other things, live streaming technology. So, whether, virtual concerts are like a thing to stay forever, or whether there's some kind of hybrid model, I think we just want to have the ability to be able to capture live performance, digitally, and either, store it or present it, present it concurrently. I think, and yeah, when you look at local festivals, like Pop Montreal is fairly local. 80% of our audience is based in the city, but we're presenting interesting programming from all around the world. And, I often get emails or comments like, oh, I'm such a big fan of your festival, I wish I could attend. Or so, yeah, maybe there is a way, to kind of present some of the stuff, the programming for people worldwide digitally that they wouldn't be able to, achieve by, unless they came to the festival, which isn't always likely. So I think, I think we will pivot, so to speak, and integrate new technologies. I don't think it's a replacement. I think people need, we're social animals. I think we need to be around each other. I know, even when we moving, just going back to the previous discussion, when we've produced these digital events, I've avoided as much as possible doing them without any kind of live audience. I think even now, we're restarting a series on the rooftop of our office, and we're just gonna, hope that there are a few people passing by in the alleyway. There's a couple of people, who are hearing the show from their balconies. I think just having a handful of people present just makes a huge difference, just for the actual energy of the show.
I would fully agree with that. I want to return to something you said that I think is really important, is that, well, I think in all of our institutions, we would recognize that there are, models, particularly with regard to the virtual, that are here to stay, but it's really not a replacement for the experience of being in the company of others, in my case, or in the case of the Musée des Beaux-Arts, of being in the presence of a painting. Just like looking at somebody on the screen is not the same as being in the company of that person. And that's one thing that we've really seen. Even before the pandemic, there was so much discourse around the advantages or disadvantages of really building up a virtual presence for a museum, because we want people to actually come in the museum and not just see paintings or works of art on a screen. And we found that, in fact, the digital works is kind of in a symbiotic relationship with the présentiel, and that people have been inspired to come to the museum by the virtual events that we're doing. And in terms of the kind of new opportunities that come with it. Juste pour vous donner un exemple, il y a une semaine, on a fait un événement pour lancer l'exposition de Caroline Monet, et il y avait 2000 personnes en ligne pendant qu'on l'a fait, et en présentiel, quand on fait ce type d'événement, on peut avoir un maximum 250 personnes dans l'auditorium. Alors, ça nous permet de se joindre à d'autres publics, d'être plus inclusifs. And so I think we are going to maintain that kind of hybrid model to increase the access, and also provide, I received many comments after that vernissage saying, oh, well, normal vernissage, c'est comme un cocktail, mais personne comprend vraiment qu'est-ce que c'est le projet, c'est quoi vraiment le contenu. Et donc, ça permet une compréhension plus profonde. So it's sort of been reassuring, I would say, to know that these models of operating that were forced by the pandemic actually boost up the core mission of the institution as well.
I would agree with that in many ways. Our Dance Forth series has reached people who would never be able to come to Ottawa and see performances. I mean, certainly, far and wide, and we've had a lot of that kind of response. And I would also say that artists have really embraced digital by force, by necessity, by whatever. There were programs that were announced to support digital captation before the pandemic by major funding institutions. And the arts community was like, oh no, it's not, it doesn't replace live art. And now, of course, because many artistic organizations have been pushed to the opportunity to create digital being the only way that they can connect with their public, people have learned a lot. Videographers and dance artists who have begun to look at their work as a possible translation to a two-dimensional stage, a three-dimensional art form to a two-dimensional stage. The quality of everything has really improved. So I don't think that people will necessarily replace the live experience, but the other thing is that we've seen in many of you have been forced to do smaller concerts, smaller performances. You're only allowed a certain number of performers on stage. I can't wait to see a big ensemble work, 10, 15 dancers moving on stage and touching each other. So I think there's going to be some transition between the solo duo into a larger work that we're all going to be very, very hungry for. But I don't think it's going to completely replace the fact that people are going to be making digital content. Maybe the lines will be thicker between what's made for the live stage and what's made for digital content. But I do think that hybrid model will continue.
Nous, en théâtre, on a un enjeu d'argent parce que ça coûte très cher. Et moi, ce que j'ai réalisé, au début, bon, il y a eu des subventions, on les a utilisées, puis on a fait une captation. Moi, j'ai réalisé que ce n'est pas mon métier. Donc, si une boîte de production vient me voir et dit « on s'occupe de tout, on va faire une captation de ton spectacle », j'ai rien contre ça. Je suis très ouvert et il faut aussi que les diffuseurs embarquent, Télé-Québec, Radio-Canada, parce que si c'est seulement sur notre plateforme, par exemple, mais ça ne va pas rejoindre assez de gens. Alors, moi, je pense que si les diffuseurs, Télé-Québec l'a fait pendant 1 an, ils vont le refaire encore, donc ils ont fait comme 6 captations de danse, de théâtre et musique aussi, donc moi, je suis pour, mais j'ai réalisé que ce n'était pas mon métier. Le plaisir que j'ai, c'est la rencontre avec le public et le spectacle qu'on a créé avec les artistes sur scène. Et c'est cette rencontre-là, live, qui m'allume et où je trouve un grand plaisir. Alors, en ayant fait la captation, j'avais comme un deuil. Oui, il y a une certaine fierté de dire, bon, ben, on a réussi à faire une captation, le spectacle va vivre chez les gens. On est allé rejoindre, grosso modo, 2000 personnes, alors que normalement, pour un spectacle, on va en chercher 6000. Alors, ça donne aussi une idée. Tu sais, je voulais le confronter pour voir un petit peu comment... On a eu quelques personnes qui nous ont témoigné qui appréciaient, mais moi, je crois que quand les choses vont revenir à la normale, cette intimité-là que les gens recherchent avec l'art vivant va revenir très fort.
La discussion est tellement intéressante, j'aurais pu vous garder pour 3 heures. Je regarde le temps aller. J'aurais envie de rebondir et peut-être commencer par Philippe, puisque vous avez rouvert vos salles là, dans des conditions différentes depuis quelques semaines maintenant. Une des choses sur lesquelles je trouve qu'il est très intéressant de spéculer, c'est la mesure dans laquelle les gens seront prêts après la pandémie, bon, et surtout dans la mesure où ce que les épidémiologistes nous disent, c'est qu'on ne sera jamais vraiment dans l'après-pandémie. Il y aura toujours un niveau de risque beaucoup plus modéré que celui qu'on a connu à une certaine époque. Je me demande, et je serais intéressé de vous entendre, et surtout ceux d'entre vous qui avaient commencé donc à reconnecter avec des publics en chair et en os, qu'est-ce que vous voyez de la mesure dans laquelle les gens sont prêts à revenir dans des espaces comme ils étaient avant? Je peux vous faire le témoignage, Mary-Dailey, que la première expérience culturelle post-pandémique ou pendant la pandémie, c'est que je suis allé voir l'exposition Léopold. Et bon, je me souviens des salles du musée complètement bondées où on a du mal à regarder, on est vraiment épaule à épaule. Là, évidemment, les salles étaient beaucoup plus moins occupées. Et malgré cela, je sentais chez moi-même et chez les autres une sorte de réticence. On n'a pas envie d'être trop près les uns des autres. Bon, quand je pense au théâtre, pour des raisons économiques que vous avez bien mentionnées, Philippe, et les petites salles, par exemple, que Dan dans lesquels Dan organise des concerts. Un des charmes, mais aussi une des conditions économiques, c'est qu'on soit assez étroitement pactés les uns par rapport aux autres. Est-ce que vous sentez un désir des gens de revenir à cette proximité, à cette intimité, ou au contraire, est-ce que vous pensez que les habitudes vont changer et vont faire de sorte que, mon Dieu, il y avait une époque où on s'asseyait tellement proches les uns des autres que on se toussait les uns sur les autres et que plus jamais ce genre de choses ne se présentera. Comment est-ce que vous sentez l'avenir immédiat?
Les gens vont revenir. Ils reviennent déjà. En ce moment, on le sent. Ça a été une réponse enthousiaste. Les gens, s'ils sentent que les mesures mises en place sanitaires sont rigoureuses, ils font confiance à l'expérience. Ils ont juste besoin de se sentir encadrés. Et même en septembre, quand on a rouvert, ça a été un enthousiasme aussi très grand. Là. Alors, moi, je ne vois pas, il n'y a pas d'enjeu. Le message qu'on reçoit, là, c'est de dire on a hâte de revenir, on a besoin. Chaque personne qui passe en ce moment à la licorne, c'est ça, c'est le message qui nous renvoie. Ça nous fait tellement du bien d'être assis dans une salle, de voir des gens sur scène, cette communion-là. Alors, moi, j'ai très confiance.
Je ne sais pas si quelqu'un d'autre veut rebondir sur cette question là de la.
Oui, je suis d'accord avec ça. I think people are desperate to get back to the theater on some level. I think that it will depend where you are, because as I said earlier, the situation that we're living in Ontario is different than the situation that we're living in Quebec. But the National Arts Centre has been involved in lots of studies across the country, as have I'm sure many of you. And people want to come back. They want to feel that they're getting the right communication from organizations, that things will be safe, that things will be taken care of. Maybe we'll have shows without intermissions for a certain period of time, because that intermission thing might be a little bit more complicated. I've been to see a few shows at l'Agora de la Danse recently, and I felt very well taken care of, the way we go in and the way we go out. So I think that that's the message that organizations are communicating to the public. Of course, as the vaccines roll out, people are going to be more comfortable and more confident. But I think that the reason that they come in the first place, the joy and the spiritual connection and all the things that live art gives them, maybe we won't be in a mosh pit for a while, but I do think that people want to come and have a live experience as soon as they feel safe enough to do that.
Yeah.
Speaking of mosh pits, Dan.
Yeah. Well, someone told me the other day that like this summer is going to be the summer of sex. So I feel like
Oh, thank God.
I feel like there's definitely like a desire, like I mean, it really depends on the demographic and who you're speaking to. I think younger people, not that they didn't take the pandemic seriously, but I think there's just like a much greater willingness to kind of engage in some of the like more intimate sides of social gatherings. I mean, I think no matter what, like producers and institutions will have to follow the rules. So I don't think mosh pits will be like a reality for quite some time, at least here in in Quebec. That being said, I spoke to a colleague in Texas yesterday, and she said, at least 70% of the people never really believed in the pandemic to begin with, and like refused to wear masks even when it was policy. So, and there were always like country music shows the whole time, that were happening. So who knows, like, but yeah, I think I think there's not going to be like a Thanos moment, snap the fingers, everything's back. I think it's just like a gradual, development. And I mean, I don't necessarily believe in like this idea of normal. Like, I think normal is like, everything will always be changing. So we'll just adapt and adjust. And I think people have a desire for music, art, culture, and all these things. And humans will just always find a way to kind of be able to be a part of it.
It's really interesting what you said about the summer of sex. I am completely by random reading.
That's our next webinar.
Next webinar, summer of sex. I love it. Or next exhibition at the museum. Who knows? We can do some kind of performance. But I'm actually reading this book about Churchill in World War II, and during all the bombings, there was an incredible amount, apparently, of sexual activity because people just felt like we need to be together. We need to express our kind of love for one another. Et je pense que, comme les autres, je sens vraiment le désir d'être dans les salles en compagnie d'autres, de partager une expérience de l'art. Je sens aussi, je dirais que je sens aussi le réticence. Et là, ce que Philippe a dit est vraiment important. C'est important que les gens se sentent en sécurité. Et quand les gens, et si les gens ne sont pas en sécurité, qui nous disent, c'est important, nous, on fait très attention à des commentaires qui viennent de la part de nos visiteurs pour s'assurer que tout le monde se sent en bonne santé, que les règles, on a toutes sortes de pastilles par terre pour indiquer les 6 mètres de distance, etc. Parce que même s'il y a un désir d'être au musée, on sent aussi, je vous dis en toute honnêteté, que les gens vont être certaines qu'ils sont en sécurité pendant qu'ils sont dans les salles.
Parce que, excusez-moi,
allez-y, Philippe.
Ben, on doit dire quand même qu'on est à un cas de refermer. Si jamais, dans toutes nos institutions, s'il y avait un cas se déclarait ou une propagation, c'est sûr qu'à ce moment-là, donc on a une grande responsabilité. Puis moi, c'est ce que je répétais tout le temps à l'équipe, on ne lésine pas sur la sécurité, sur les mesures. On ne peut pas. On est responsable de tout le secteur culturel à ce moment-là.
Je vois des questions très intéressantes qui émergent dans le Q&A, mais j'aurais envie de vous en poser une dernière et avant de poser des questions qui nous ont été proposées par le public. Vos relations avec les différents niveaux de gouvernement, que ce soit municipal ou provincial, j'imagine que c'est surtout à ces 2 niveaux-là que vous interagissez. Comment se sont-ils déroulés? Comment se déroulent-ils? Est-ce que vous sentez que l'urgence de rouvrir le monde de la culture et des arts est aussi important que l'urgence ressentie de manière aussi forte par les différents niveaux de gouvernement que d'autres secteurs de l'économie? On a entendu parfois des plaintes venant du milieu à l'effet que peut-être que cette urgence-là n'a pas été suffisamment ressentie. Comment est-ce que ça s'est passé pour vous, vos relations avec l'État?
Ben, moi, je peux dire, comme j'ai dit au début, la fermeture, au début, tout le monde la comprenait. En septembre, quand on a pu rouvrir, seulement pour un mois, celle-là, elle nous a pris par surprise parce qu'on avait mis toutes les mesures en place qui sont similaires à ce qu'on fait en ce moment. Donc, la justification de fermer en octobre pendant plusieurs mois puis de réouvrir, elle était plus difficile à accepter, à comprendre, mais malgré tout, je respecte totalement là, les choix qu'ils ont à faire. On ne voudrait pas être à leur place, mais c'est sûr qu'elle a été difficile et je crois que malgré tout, le gouvernement a compris au fur et à mesure l'importance de la place de l'art. Ils se sont investis aussi dans des mesures pour aider les compagnies qui ont été très, très salutaires parce que ça nous a permis de continuer à répéter. Donc, même si le public n'était pas présent pour les spectacles, mais les artistes pouvaient répéter dans nos salles. On a pu créer des laboratoires, réunir des gens toujours en distance, mais les artistes ont pu travailler et être rémunérés. Donc, j'ai senti que cet investissement-là...
Est-ce que, je ne sais pas si d'autres, Dan, Mary-Dailey, Kathy, if you wanted to jump in on the question of...
Yeah, I would just add that, there's also been a lot of federal, it depends again on which province you're in. Quebec has been, as usual, very proactive in supporting culture in ways that some other provinces, it's not necessarily on their radar in the same way. So, but there's also been, thankfully, some federal programs that finally began to support freelancers and independent artists. When you think about dancers, for example, unless you're part of a big company, you're not making your living as a dancer. You're making your living, as supplementing as a waitress. Oh, that's gone. Or you're supplementing as a childcare worker. Oh, that's gone. All the other places where income has been supplemented, those places have closed too. So that was a fundamental switch when I think we're going to lose a lot of people in the field, which will be sad to come out the other end and realize that many people just couldn't survive. But the CERB, when it became available to independent artists and freelancers, I think made a big difference federally. So that's something I think that really needs to be mentioned. And I also would say that culture is continually fighting for a place in the eyes of the government in terms of their policies. And during the pandemic, I think those conversations have heightened in very interesting ways, and we will see some really positive things that come out of that.
Mhm. Je suis.
Non,
c'est juste pour dire que je suis tout à fait d'accord. Le soutien qu'on a reçu de la part du gouvernement fédéral et provincial était très, très important pour nous. Tout au long de la pandémie, le musée était en conversation avec le ministère de la Culture et on a essayé de plaidoyer nos cas de rester ouverts. C'est sûr que on comprenait les fermetures. Il y avait des frustrations qu'on partage avec Philippe. C'était difficile. It was a lack of visibility that was very, very difficult at a certain moment. And I think certainly for the government too, nobody had a crystal ball to say when cases were going to go down, when it was going to be possible. I would say that there really was a sense of listening, but it was the unpredictability était très, très difficile pour les institutions, mais on est en même temps très reconnaissante de soutien qu'on a reçu.
So I'm curious about whether I'm going to sort of meld together a couple of the questions that have come into the chat, which in a way connect with the theme of relationship of artistic institutions with the government. So we've seen in European countries, for example, that there have been experiments. I think one happened in Liverpool just the other day, of another one in Scandinavia somewhere, of getting people together in larger numbers using rapid testing in order to see whether it was sustainable to have much larger numbers in cultural spaces than the ones that we have had now. There is talk in Canada and more than talk in other places, for example, in Israel, of using vaccination passes or proofs of vaccination in order to monitor and control access to spaces. Has any of that become part of the conversation here? Anybody, Dan?
Well, I think we're pretty far behind all that in terms of, of producers and events kind of like looking into, or at least, like doing a rapid test scenario. A few people have brought it up to me, and I don't know if it's like a lack of cohesion between like the various levels of government and implementation. But it is a good, like, these are all like interesting questions. I guess there has to be, some sort of relationship between the state and whether it was like the Liverpool event. I think there was one in Barcelona as well. There has to be like, significant, like it's an experiment, right? So there has there may be some talks between different government bodies and cultural producers to do that kind of thing, but I'm not aware of it. And I think like it's a major investment. I know people who work in the film industry, it's like hundreds and hundreds of thousands of dollars that they're spending just to do the rapid testing, like, and for the employees who are coming in 3 or 4 times a week. So I don't think there's the money in terms of like the cultural sector to be able to do that at the moment in Canada.
The idea of vaccination passports, though, has been in the media a lot, and as vaccinations become more readily available. I just read minutes before we went online that they would now be made available in Quebec to 12 to 17-year-olds, so teenagers will be covered. is that something that's been part of the conversation, that as they become available to everyone so that no one would be excluded unjustly, we start requiring proof of vaccination? Is that something that has been part of the discussion for access to spaces like museums or theaters, or Kathy, to the National Arts Center?
It's part of the conversation for sure. I think we're in discussion with the government agencies about it. I think there's questions of privacy. And, that is one of the key things that we're discussing. I think that if a policy were put in place, I know a lot of my American partners are just going ahead and asking for that in their venues, even without their states putting those things in place. I think that we would be open to it if it were, if the hurdles were discussed and people felt comfortable with, how those hurdles were going to be dealt with.
Same here, really. We're it's part of the conversation around the table, but not yet in the advanced stages, because again, it's sort of a lack of visibility, and there are a lot of important ethical questions in play as well. So we're kind of in a little bit of a waiting game with that to see where the government kind of comes down and how accessible these vaccines become.
So I'm gonna. Deb, please.
I feel like it would be like a constitutional issue, wouldn't it? Like on some level, like there'll definitely be people who would challenge it.
Well, it depends, it's interesting because there's this art fair going on right now, Freeze New York, and in order to go in, it's not state mandated, but in order to go in, you have to show proof of either you are fully vaccinated and you have been for 2 weeks prior, or that you got a test within the last 24 hours. And if you don't have that proof that comes from a medical record on your phone that says like negative or vaccinated, you cannot enter. And that was a decision of a private organization to do that, which is interesting. Et selon ce que j'ai entendu, les gens qui se sont entrés se sont en bonne sécurité, justement parce qu'ils savaient que les gens ont testé négatif ou were vaccinated. But whether that can be applied to large, particularly government-funded institutions, I think we're not there yet.
We only have a couple of minutes left, so maybe I'll just meld together another couple of questions for you that, in a way, you've all touched on in one way or another. Artists live, the vast majority, financially precarious lives, where very often they depend not just on the revenues from their art, but also on other sources of income that may also have been dried out by the pandemic. One of the things that has interested me a lot across vast swaths of the impacts of the pandemic on society is the way in which it has exacerbated fault lines that already exist in society, economic fault lines. Is your sense that that more can be done in order to protect artists, so to make it the case that the people who survive the pandemic and are able to continue to produce their art are not the already most privileged practitioners, but people who are perhaps, the precariously funded artists will not drop out, as it were, in virtue of the economic hardship that's been visited upon them? Has government been doing enough? Are the funding models that we've seen beginning to address the realization that there are a lot of have-nots in the artistic world who deserve to be supported by public institutions and by public funding?
Oui, ils sont en train de le faire. Le Conseil des arts et lettres du Québec a justement annoncé dernièrement des fonds spécifiquement pour des artistes, pour des laboratoires. Je pense que dans un premier temps, ils ont voulu protéger les institutions, ce qui est une bonne chose parce que c'est quand même les institutions qui engagent les artistes aussi. Donc, et dans un deuxième temps, ce qu'ils sont en train de faire, on le sent, c'est vraiment d'envoyer des aides spécifiques pour les artistes. Et ça a déjà été fait. Moi, bon, je siège même au Conseil des arts de Montréal et il y a beaucoup de gestes qui ont été faits dans ce sens-là.
Yeah, I would say, I think it is incumbent on all of us to, especially as like gatekeepers, et cetera, to provide as much funding opportunities to, a diverse section of artists. That being said, I would say, unless until there's like universal basic income, I think there will always be disparities, and marginalized communities will suffer for sure.
The theme of one of my seminars in the law school of McGill University just this past semester, universal basic income. Kathy, Mary-Dailey, a last word?
I would say that, you know, my whole raison d'etre in the last 14 months is to get as much of our resources as possible to artists, to lift up the sector, to help them continue creating, rehearsing, etc. Will young dance and theater artists and you know, one of the things they rely on for their income is touring. When touring comes back, then more income will come into those companies, and therefore they will then be able to engage artists to perform and be supported. But I agree with you, Dan. I think it's a ways off before especially emerging artists are making a living wage and don't have to do other things in order to pay the rent. I look forward to that day for sure.
Yes, we all do, absolutely. I also agree with the fact that we have a responsibility to do absolutely all that we can to make sure that we are supporting our artists. You know, I see the difficulty that so many performing artists really have, which is, you know, the lack of place to practice and master their art, or continue to refine their art. It's very difficult. You know, at the museum, we're trying our best to provide platforms for all different kinds of artists, particularly our local community is very important to us, to kind of give them a voice on our digital platforms. It's not always easy to know where to go. I do think the government, as you mentioned earlier, Kathy, is trying to support independent artists and has kind of recognized that there's a real problem there. But I think that we're all, as you said, waiting for the day that there's more quality in the way these things work out, and doing the best we can in the meantime to support our artists.
So we've unfortunately run out of time. As I predicted, I could have spent another 2 hours talking to all of you, but that's all the time that we have for today. Thank you very much to all four of you for agreeing to be part of this conversation. Speaking for myself, I just can't wait to get myself back into the spaces that you run. It's been a tough 14 months, and I'm happy to see that we're already getting there, at least to some degree. Merci à tous ceux d'entre vous qui avez écouté la conversation. S'il y a des questions que j'ai pas eu le temps de poser, j'en suis désolé. Je vous rappelle que l'enregistrement de notre conversation sera placé sur notre canal YouTube. Des informations seront communiquées à toutes les personnes qui se sont enregistrées. Donc, sur ce, il ne me reste qu'à remercier une fois de nouveau tous nos panélistes et de vous souhaiter une excellente après-midi.